That necklace should be with the real Wilson women. Take it off right now, Patricia commanded, her perfectly manicured fingers extended across the Michelin-starred restaurant's table toward my neck. The diamond pendant my late grandmother had left me, the very one I'd built my entire company logo around, glimmered under the soft lighting as every head at our anniversary dinner turned to witness this power play. My husband David froze beside me, caught in that familiar trap between wife and mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Patricia didn't realize as she sat there, Ice Queen perfect, in her designer outfit, was that I hadn't risen from foster care to CEO of Seattle's fastest-growing security firm by letting people take what was mine. And she certainly didn't know about the 3 highly trained security professionals who had just received my discreet text alert. Those same professionals who were now making their way across the restaurant floor toward our table. My name is Emily Johnson. I'm 38 years old, founder and CEO of Sentinel Shield Security Solutions. 10 years ago, I was a nobody, a former foster kid with nothing but a computer science degree, crippling student loans, and an unshakable work ethic. Today, I run a multi-million-dollar security technology company that protects some of the biggest names in tech, finance, and entertainment. My journey wasn't easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. Standing in my way since the beginning has been Patricia Wilson, my mother-in-law and self-appointed guardian of the Wilson family legacy. The Wilsons are old Seattle money, third-generation tech investors who helped fund some of the city's earliest software ventures. They live in a waterfront mansion on Mercer Island, attend charity galas, and have a family crest. I'm not joking, an actual crest, emblazoned on everything from napkins to the gates of their estate. I met their son David during a cybersecurity conference where I was presenting on emerging threats to high-net-worth individuals. He was intelligent, kind, and refreshingly down-to-earth despite his privileged upbringing. When he asked for my number after my presentation, I gave it to him without hesitation, even though men like David Wilson, heir to a technology fortune, Harvard MBA, chiseled jawline straight out of central casting, didn't typically go for women with my background. Our romance moved quickly. David appreciated my drive, my expertise in a field he respected, and the fact that I called things exactly as I saw them. Within 8 months, he proposed with a vintage emerald ring he'd selected himself, rather than using the traditional Wilson family diamond, his first act of independence that raised Patricia's perfectly arched eyebrows. "Are you sure about this, darling?" she'd asked during our first dinner together at their estate, her gaze sliding over my simple black dress like she was assessing its clearance rack potential. "You've only known each other such a short time, and your backgrounds are so different." Robert, David's father, had peered at me over his whiskey glass. "What did you say your people do, Emily?" "My people?" I'd replied evenly. "Well, I don't really have people, Mr. Wilson. I grew up in the foster system. But I founded Sentinel Shield Security 5 years ago. We've just secured our 4th round of funding." Patricia's smile had tightened. "How quaint. A self-made woman. David has always had such a soft heart for underdogs." I should have recognized that moment for what it was, not just a passing slight, but a declaration of war. Patricia Wilson had built her identity around being the perfect corporate wife, the flawless society matron, the keeper of the Wilson flame. My existence, and worse, David's love for me, threatened the carefully curated dynasty she'd spent decades maintaining. The wedding was the first battlefield. Patricia had visions of a 300-guest extravaganza at the Seattle Yacht Club, with ice sculptures and society photographers. What we had instead was an intimate ceremony at a boutique hotel overlooking Puget Sound with just 50 guests, most of them my colleagues and the handful of close friends I'd made since aging out of the foster system at 18. "It's just not how things are done in our circle," Patricia had lamented to anyone who would listen. The Wilson family has certain traditions, certain expectations. I'd maintained my composure, recognizing that this was just the opening salvo. David had stood firmly beside me, though I could see the toll his mother's disapproval was taking on him. He loved his parents, especially his father, who had been his mentor in business. The thought of disappointing them weighed on him, creating invisible fissures in our relationship that I was determined not to let break open. After the wedding, Patricia's campaign became more subtle, but no less determined. There were the accidental exclusions from family events. "Oh, Emily, did David not tell you about the foundation dinner? I was certain I mentioned it to him." The backhanded compliments about my company. "It's so admirable how you keep that little security business going despite the competition." The constant reminders of David's family heritage and my lack thereof. But I wasn't without resources of my own. Growing up in the system, bouncing between foster homes, I'd developed an uncanny ability to read people, to sense threats before they materialized. These skills had helped me build Sentinel Shield from a one-woman consultancy to a company with over 60 employees and contracts with major tech firms throughout the Pacific Northwest. I could handle one disapproving mother-in-law, no matter how connected she was. Or so I thought until the incident at the McKinley benefit 3 years into our marriage. The annual McKinley Foundation Gala was the social event of the season for Seattle's tech elite. As major donors, the Wilsons always occupied a prominent table near the stage. That year, given Sentinel Shield's growing profile and our recent success securing a major contract with a multinational tech giant, David and I had been invited independently of his parents, a fact that had clearly rankled Patricia. "Emily, you're here!" she'd exclaimed with exaggerated surprise when we encountered each other in the venue's opulent foyer. "David, darling, I thought you'd be joining us at the family table as usual." "Mom, I told you last week that Emily and I received our own invitation this year," David had replied, his hand tightening slightly around mine. Sentinel Shield was recognized for their pro bono work securing the McKinley Children's Hospital data systems. Patricia's smile had remained fixed, her eyes cooling by several degrees. "How lovely. Well, I'm sure they'll have seated you somewhere. Appropriate." The implied insult was clear, but years of navigating foster homes and later male-dominated tech spaces had taught me to choose my battles. I'd simply squeezed David's hand and smiled graciously before moving toward the ballroom. The surprise had come when we discovered our table assignment. Rather than being seated with other corporate donors or technology innovators, David and I had been placed at a table near the kitchen doors with the event staff and a few clearly confused junior associates from various companies. "There must be some mistake," David had muttered, examining our place cards with a frown. My gaze had drifted toward the Wilson family table, perfectly positioned near the stage, where Patricia was watching our confusion with barely concealed satisfaction. Beside her, Robert Wilson was deep in conversation with the governor, seemingly oblivious to his wife's machinations. "No mistake," I'd said quietly. "This is your mother's doing." David had started to protest, but I knew better. The seating arrangements for events like these were meticulously planned months in advance, with careful consideration given to social hierarchies and donor relationships. To have been relegated to what was essentially the staff table required deliberate intervention from someone with significant influence. "Let's just find the organizer and sort this out," David had suggested, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'd placed a calming hand on his arm. "No, that's exactly what she wants, to see me flustered, out of place, unprepared. We're staying right here." And we had. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Throughout that interminable evening, I'd made conversation with the surprised waitstaff and junior associates at our table, gathering business cards and making connections that would later prove valuable. From time to time, I'd caught Patricia, watching us, her expression growing increasingly perplexed as the evening wore on, and I showed no signs of the humiliation she'd clearly anticipated. When the time came for major donors to be recognized from the stage, David and I had stood with the others when Sentinel Shield's contribution was announced. The spotlight had found us at our kitchen-adjacent table, and I'd smiled confidently, making direct eye contact with Patricia across the room as applause filled the ballroom. That night had marked a turning point in my relationship with my mother-in-law. Her realization that I couldn't be easily cowed seemed to intensify her determination to find my breaking point. The slights became more frequent, more pointed, particularly around my background and the jewelry that had become synonymous with my personal brand. My grandmother's diamond pendant was the only family heirloom I possessed. Eleanor Johnson had been my last living relative, the woman who had taken me in after my final disastrous foster placement. She hadn't had much, just a modest home in Tacoma and the pendant her husband had given her on their 25th anniversary. When she passed away during my sophomore year of college, the pendant was her parting gift to me. "This is your heritage, Emily," she'd told me weeks before she died, pressing the white gold and diamond piece into my palm. "Not much compared to some, I know, but it's yours. Proof that you come from people who loved each other, who persevered. Wear it, and remember that you're never truly alone." When I founded Sentinel Shield, I'd incorporated the distinctive shield-shaped pendant into our company logo, a visual reminder of protection and personal heritage that resonated with our high-net-worth clients, who were, after all, often concerned with preserving their own legacies. Patricia had noticed the pendant during our first meeting and had asked about it with seemingly casual interest. "Family heirloom?" she'd inquired, her tone suggesting she doubted I could possess such a thing. "Yes," I'd answered simply, "from my grandmother." I'd seen the assessment in her eyes, calculating the pendant's value, its significance, its worthiness to hang around the neck of a woman married to her son. Even then, something in her expression had made me uneasy, though I couldn't have predicted how that seemingly innocent inquiry would evolve into the confrontation we now faced. The 10th anniversary dinner had been David's idea, a celebration at Lumiere, Seattle's most exclusive restaurant, with both sets of parents in attendance. Robert and Patricia Wilson, of course, and Jessica and Michael Chen, my former foster, parents who had re-entered my life after seeing a feature about Sentinel Shield in the Seattle Business Journal. They weren't technically my parents, having fostered me for just under a year when I was 15, but they were the closest thing to family I had besides David. I'd had reservations about the dinner from the start. Patricia had never bothered to hide her disdain for the Chens. Jessica was a high school counselor, Michael an electrical engineer at a local manufacturing firm. They lived in a modest craftsman in Ballard, drove a Subaru, and had absolutely no understanding of or interest in the social hierarchies that governed Patricia's world. "Must we really include your foster connections?" Patricia had asked David when he'd first proposed the dinner. "Anniversary celebrations are typically intimate family affairs." "The Chens are Emily's family," David had replied firmly. "They'll be joining us." I'd loved him for that moment of backbone, rare as it was when it came to his mother. David tried, he truly did, but a lifetime of conditioning wasn't easily overcome. More often than not, he found himself trapped between his loyalty to me and his ingrained deference to his parents, especially his father, whose approval he still desperately sought. The evening had started tensely but civilly enough. We'd gathered in Lumiere's private dining room, the Seattle skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Chens had arrived first, Jessica hugging me warmly, Michael shaking David's hand with genuine affection. They'd brought a thoughtfully selected bottle of Washington wine and a card containing gift certificates for a weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast in the San Juan Islands. The Wilsons had arrived precisely on time, Patricia resplendent in a Chanel suit, a large sapphire and diamond necklace, the actual Wilson family heirloom gleaming at her throat. Robert had followed in her wake, distinguished and distant as, always, offering perfunctory greetings before ordering a bottle of Dom Perignon. 10 years, Patricia had said after the champagne was poured, her gaze sweeping over me appraisingly. Who would have thought? The implied surprise that our marriage had lasted stung, but I'd smiled politely, my hand finding David's under the table. Time flies when you're building something worthwhile together. David had raised his glass to partnerships, in business and in life. We'd clinked glasses, and for a moment, I'd allowed myself to hope that perhaps the evening might unfold without incident. That hope had died during the main course when Patricia had turned the conversation toward family legacies. "Robert and I have been discussing our estate planning recently," she'd announced, cutting into her perfectly cooked halibut. "Ensuring the Wilson heritage is properly preserved for future generations is so important." Jessica Chen had nodded, enthusiastically, missing the subtext entirely. "That's wonderful. Michael and I just updated our wills too, though we don't have much to leave besides the house." Patricia's smile hadn't reached her eyes. "Yes. Well, when you have centuries of family history to consider, it becomes quite complex. The Wilson collection alone requires significant consideration." "Collection?" Michael had asked politely. "Family jewels, artwork, properties with historical significance," Patricia had explained, touching her sapphire necklace. "Items that should remain with those who understand their true value and connection to the Wilson name." Her gaze had drifted meaningfully to my throat, where my grandmother's pendant rested. It wasn't an especially valuable piece by objective standards, perhaps worth a few $1,000s, but its personal significance was immeasurable. And more importantly, it had become inextricably linked with my professional identity. "Speaking of family pieces," Patricia had continued, her voice taking on an edge I recognized all too well, "I've been meaning to discuss that pendant you're wearing, Emily." I'd instinctively reached up to touch the diamond, feeling a sudden chill despite the room's comfortable temperature. "My grandmother's pendant?" "Yes. I couldn't help but notice that you've been using a remarkably similar design in your company. Materials. Given that you're married to a Wilson now and that symbol has become somewhat public, there are intellectual property considerations." David had looked up sharply from his meal. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "That's Emily's personal jewelry that predates our relationship." Patricia had waved her hand dismissively. "Darling, you don't understand how these things work. Now that Emily is associated with the Wilson name, her business imagery reflects on our family. That pendant design should properly be controlled by the family trust." The Chens had exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing the underlying current, but unsure how to navigate these unfamiliar waters. Jessica had attempted to change the subject, asking Robert about their recent trip to Europe, but Patricia had been undeterred. "I think," she'd continued, setting down her fork with deliberate precision, "that the pendant should be placed in the Wilson collection for safekeeping. After all, if you and David have children someday, it would be appropriate for any daughters to receive it from the family matriarch." The restaurant around us had seemed to fade away as I'd stared at Patricia, finally understanding the full scope of her intentions. This wasn't just about the pendant itself. This was about erasing me, my identity, my heritage, my accomplishments, and absorbing anything of value into the Wilson narrative. "That necklace should be with the real Wilson women. Take it off right now," Patricia had commanded, her perfectly manicured fingers extended across the table toward my neck. The diamond pendant my late grandmother had left me, the very one I'd built my entire company logo around, glimmered under the soft lighting as every head at our anniversary dinner turned to witness this power play. My husband David froze beside me, caught in that familiar trap between wife and mother. The silence that followed her demand seemed to stretch into infinity. Jessica Chen's mouth had dropped open in shock. Michael had placed a protective hand on his wife's shoulder. Robert. Wilson had continued eating as though his wife hadn't just launched a tactical nuclear strike at the dinner table. And David. David had looked paralyzed, his face a mask of conflicted loyalties. In that moment of crystalline clarity, I'd realized that this confrontation had been inevitable from the beginning. Patricia would never accept me as an equal, never acknowledge my right to exist in her son's life as anything other than a subordinate to the Wilson legacy. And perhaps more painfully, David would always be caught in the middle, unable to fully break free from the gravitational pull of his family's expectations. But I was not without resources of my own. 10 years of building a security empire had taught me to anticipate threats and prepare accordingly. While Patricia saw only the foster kid who had somehow snared her son, I saw her for what she was, a predictable adversary whose moves I had anticipated long ago. Beneath the table, my thumb had moved across my phone screen, activating the silent alert system I'd developed for Sentinel's highest-risk clients. 3 dots on a security monitoring panel across town had immediately begun moving. Deployment initiated. "No, Patricia," I'd said, my voice calm and clear in the stunned silence. "I won't be doing that." Her eyes had widened slightly, unaccustomed to direct refusal. "I don't think you understand, Emily. This isn't a request." "I understand perfectly," I'd replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "You believe that anything in proximity to the Wilson name automatically becomes Wilson property. You've been trying to establish that principle since the day David and I became engaged. But there's something you should know." I'd leaned forward, slightly, noting the nervousness that flickered across her perfect features. "I built Sentinel Shield Security from nothing into one of the most respected private security firms in the Pacific Northwest. I protect people, assets, and legacies for a living. Did you really think I wouldn't protect my own?" The restaurant's private dining room door had opened, and 3 individuals had entered. 2 men and a woman, all in impeccable business attire. To casual observers, they might have appeared to be fellow diners or restaurant staff, but the earpieces they wore and their alert, assessing gazes revealed their true purpose to anyone who knew what to look for. Mrs. Wilson, Marcus Williams, my head of personal security operations, had greeted Patricia with professional courtesy. "Is everything all right here, Ms. Johnson?" Patricia's face had flushed with angry color. "Who are these people? David, what is the meaning of this?" David had finally found his voice, though it came out strained. "Emily, was this necessary?" I'd turned to him then, feeling a deep sadness beneath my determination. "Yes, it was. Your mother just demanded that I surrender my grandmother's pendant, my company's symbol, in front of my family at our anniversary dinner. Tell me what response would have been appropriate." The security team had taken up discreet positions around the room, not threatening but unmistakably present. Jessica and Michael Chen had exchanged looks of confusion tinged with growing admiration. Robert Wilson had finally set down his fork, his expression unreadable as he observed the situation. "This is absurd," Patricia had sputtered. "You brought security guards to an anniversary dinner?" "This only proves what I've always said. You don't understand our world, our ways." "No, Patricia," I'd replied quietly. "I understand your world perfectly. I simply refuse to let it diminish mine. My security team is here because I anticipated that sooner or later you would make a move against something truly important to me. They're here to ensure that everyone remains calm while we resolve this situation with dignity." Marcus had stepped forward. "Ms. Johnson, would you like us to escort anyone from the premises?" Patricia's eyes had widened in genuine shock at the implication that she, Patricia Wilson, might be removed from one of Seattle's most exclusive restaurants like some common troublemaker. The social humiliation alone would be devastating. "That won't be necessary, Marcus," I'd said, never taking my eyes off Patricia. I believe Mrs. Wilson is going to reconsider her position." Robert Wilson had finally spoken, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Patricia, enough. You've overstepped." All eyes had turned to him in surprise. In 10 years, I had never heard him directly contradict his wife. "Robert, you can't possibly—" I said enough. His tone had left no room for argument. "Emily's pendant is her property, as is her company logo. The Wilson name has always stood for integrity in business, not this." He gestured to the security team. "The fact that Emily came prepared for this confrontation should tell you something about how predictable your behavior has become." Patricia had looked as though she'd been slapped. Robert had turned to me, something almost like respect in his usually distant gaze. "Emily, I apologize for my wife's behavior. It was inappropriate and does not reflect the values I've tried to instill in our family." I'd nodded, maintaining my composure despite my surprise. "Thank you, Robert." David had finally found his courage, reaching for my hand. "Mom, Dad's right. This has to stop. I love you both, but Emily is my wife, my partner. Her success is something to be proud of, not threatened by." Patricia had looked from face to face, realizing she had no allies at the table. Even the Chens, who had been intimidated by the Wilsons for years, were now sitting taller, Michael's arm protectively around Jessica's shoulders. "I see I'm outnumbered," Patricia had said finally, attempting to salvage her dignity. "Perhaps I spoke hastily. The pendant is lovely, Emily. A fitting tribute to your grandmother." It wasn't an apology. I doubted Patricia Wilson had apologized sincerely for anything in decades, but it was a retreat. And sometimes that's all you can hope for from an entrenched adversary. "Thank you, Patricia," I'd replied evenly. "I appreciate that clarification." I'd signaled to Marcus, who had nodded and motioned to his team. They had withdrawn as discreetly as they'd arrived, leaving the private dining room to return to their regular positions. The remainder of the dinner had proceeded in strained politeness, the elaborate dessert course barely touched by anyone at the table. When it concluded, Robert had insisted on picking up the check despite David's protests that it was our anniversary celebration. "It's the least I can do," he'd said, looking directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Outside the restaurant, as we'd waited for the valets to bring our respective cars, Patricia had pulled me aside, her grip on my arm just shy of painful. "You may have won this round," she'd hissed, her public mask momentarily discarded. "But don't think this changes anything. The Wilson family has navigated social climbers for generations." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. "That's where you're still mistaken, Patricia. I'm not climbing anywhere. I built my own mountain." David and I had driven home in silence, the weight of the evening hanging between us. It wasn't until we were back in our Lake Washington waterfront home, purchased with my company's profits, not Wilson money, that he'd finally spoken. "I'm sorry," he'd said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have shut that down immediately." I just froze. I'd turned to him, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes. "Yes, you should have. But I understand why it's difficult for you." "That's no excuse," he'd insisted, taking my hands in his. 10 years together, and I'm still caught between worlds. But seeing you tonight, watching how you handled yourself, you were magnificent, Emily. Prepared, composed, dignified. My mother never stood a chance." I'd smiled despite myself. "Security is my business, David. I've been anticipating and preparing for Patricia's escalations for years. Tonight just happened to be when she finally overplayed her hand." He'd reached up to touch the pendant at my throat, his fingers gentle against my skin. "This means everything to you, doesn't it? Not just because of your grandmother, but because of what you've built with it." "It's the only piece of my history I have," I'd acknowledged. "When I look at it, I see my grandmother, yes, but I also see every step of my journey, from foster care to Sentinel Shield. It reminds me that we can take the small legacies we're given and transform them into something powerful. David had been quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. I think that's what terrifies my mother about you. The Wilsons have spent generations carefully cultivating their legacy, but you created yours from almost nothing. It makes her question the value of everything she's built her identity around. His insight had surprised me. For all his difficulty, standing up to his parents, David had always seen me clearly. My strengths, my vulnerabilities, my uncompromising determination to forge my own path. What happens now? He'd asked. With my parents, I mean. I'd considered the question carefully. That depends largely on them, especially your mother. Tonight was a turning point. She made her play, and it failed publicly. Your father sided against her for the first time in probably decades. She'll either retreat and recalibrate, or she'll escalate further. And you'll be ready either way, he'd said. It wasn't a question. I'll be ready, I'd confirmed. But I'm hoping it won't be necessary. Your father's intervention tonight was unexpected. There might be room for a genuine reset. David had pulled me close then, his arms around my waist. Whatever comes next, I promise I won't freeze again. You deserved better tonight, and every night before this one when I've let my mother's behavior slide. I'd rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. We'll face it together. That's what these 10 years have taught us, if nothing else. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my hand instinctively reaching for the pendant at my throat, I'd reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From a frightened foster child with nothing to her name to a woman who commanded enough respect and resources to face down someone like Patricia Wilson on equal footing. My security team's arrival at the restaurant hadn't just been a power play. It had been a statement to Patricia, to David, and perhaps most importantly, to myself. I had built something lasting, something entirely my own. And while the road ahead with the Wilsons might still be complicated, tonight had established one unassailable truth. I wasn't just David Wilson's wife from humble beginnings. I was Emily Johnson, CEO of Sentinel Shield Security, a woman who had learned through hard experience to protect what was hers, whether that was a diamond pendant, a company logo, or her own hard-won dignity. And no one, not even Patricia Wilson, with all her social connections and family history, would ever make me forget it again. The morning after the anniversary dinner confrontation, I woke early, the weight of unfinished business heavy on my mind. David was still asleep beside me, his features relaxed in a way they rarely were when conscious, especially around his family. I slipped quietly from our bed and made my way to my home office, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of Lake Washington shrouded in dawn mist. This view had been my motivation during those early years when Sentinel Shield was nothing but an ambitious business plan and a rented office space near Pike Place Market. I'd keep a photo of this exact shoreline taped to my computer monitor, a constant reminder of what I was working toward when clients were scarce and 18-hour days were the norm. Now, sitting at my custom-designed desk, I opened my laptop and began my morning ritual of reviewing Sentinel's overnight security alerts. We protected everything from tech executives' homes to proprietary data systems, and threats never slept. But my mind kept drifting back to Patricia Wilson's outstretched hand and her demand for my grandmother's pendant. "You're up early, David," I said from the doorway, 2 steaming mugs in his hands. He crossed the office and set one down beside me, the rich aroma of Ethiopian beans filling the air. "Couldn't sleep?" "Just the usual morning check-in," I lied, gesturing toward my security dashboard. The Zhang account had some perimeter alerts overnight. David nodded, but his expression told me he wasn't fooled. After 10 years together, he could read me almost as well as I could read potential security threats. Almost. "Emily," he said, settling into the chair across from me, We need to talk about what happens next, with my mother, with my family. I took a careful sip of the coffee. Perfect, as always. David might have been born into privilege, but he made a point of handling certain everyday tasks himself, from brewing coffee to changing light bulbs, small rebellions against his upbringing that I'd always appreciated. "What do you want to happen next?" I asked, studying his face. This was the crux of so many of our challenges over the years. David caught between his love for me and his inability to fully separate himself from the Wilson family expectations. He ran a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. "I spoke with my father last night after you went to bed," he called to. "Oh, well, to apologize, I suppose, though in his roundabout Robert Wilson way." This surprised me. Robert had always been the more reasonable of my in-laws, but he typically maintained a studied neutrality in conflicts between Patricia and me. What did he say exactly? That Mother had been inappropriate and that he was disappointed in her behavior. David's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. Coming from my father, that's practically a declaration of war against her. He also said something that struck me, that he's always respected how you built your company from nothing, because his father made him start at the bottom of Wilson Investments despite being the heir. I raised an eyebrow. That's news to me. From Patricia's version of the family history, the Wilsons sprang fully formed from the Seattle soil, silver spoons firmly in place. My grandfather was actually a bank clerk who made a lucky investment in an early software company, David admitted. He leveraged that into Wilson Investments, but he was always worried that my father would take wealth for granted. Made him work as a janitor in the Wilson building during high school, then as a mail clerk during college breaks. Your mother never mentioned that part of the story, I said, processing this new information. It shed light on Robert's behavior at the dinner. His unexpected intervention might have come from recognizing something of his own father in my stance against Patricia. Mother prefers the polished version of family history, David said. Which brings me to what I want to happen next. I think it's time I established some firm boundaries with my parents, especially my mother. I set down my coffee mug, giving him my full attention. This was a significant shift for David, who had spent most of our relationship trying to navigate between my world and his parents, without fully committing to either. What kind of boundaries? For starters, no more attempts to diminish your accomplishments or your background. No more accidental exclusions from family events. And absolutely no more comments about your grandmother's pendant or Sentinel's logo. His jaw tightened with determination. I should have done this years ago, Emily. I'm sorry it took such a public confrontation to wake me up. I reached across the desk to take his hand. We both know your mother won't accept those terms easily. Then she'll see less of us, he said simply. Dad made it clear he doesn't support her behavior anymore. I think he's finally realized that her social maneuvering is becoming a liability rather than an asset to the Wilson name. The Wilson name. Always the Wilson name. Even in this moment of apparent breakthrough, the family legacy remained the central concern. I wondered if David realized how deeply that mindset was ingrained in him, even as he tried to break free of it. I appreciate that, I said carefully. But I need you to understand something, David. I didn't bring my security team to the dinner just to make a point. I did it because I've learned the hard way that people only respect boundaries that are enforced. Growing up in the foster system had taught me that painful lesson early. Boundaries without consequences were just wishful thinking. Each new home, each new school, each new social worker had required me to establish my limits all over again. Sometimes at significant personal cost. I know, David said, his expression somber. And I realize now that while I've been wringing my hands about being caught in the middle, you've been actively defending yourself because I failed to. This level of self-awareness was new, and I felt a flutter of hope that perhaps the anniversary dinner confrontation had catalyzed genuine change, not just in our relationship with the Wilsons, but in David's understanding of his own role in our ongoing conflicts. "So what's your plan?" I asked. "Call your mother and lay down the law?" David shook his head. "That would just give her time to prepare counter-arguments and enlist allies. I've scheduled lunch with both my parents at the Wilson Investments office today. Neutral territory for them, but with the advantage of being my professional domain rather than our family home." I nodded, impressed with his strategic thinking. "And after you establish these boundaries, what then?" "Then we see if they can respect them," he said. "Particularly Mother. If she can, we move forward with a new understanding. If she can't..." He took a deep breath. "Then we'll have to limit our interaction with them, at least until she recognizes that her behavior has consequences." The determination in his voice gave me hope, but I'd witnessed too many cycles of David's resolve followed by eventual capitulation to his mother's persistence. Patricia Wilson played the long game, retreating when necessary, but never truly surrendering ground. "I want to believe this will work," I said honestly. "But your mother has been waging this campaign for a decade. One embarrassing dinner isn't going to change her fundamental belief that I'm somehow unworthy of the precious Wilson connection." David's expression hardened in a way I rarely saw outside of his most challenging business negotiations. "Then she'll have to decide what's more important, her social pretensions or her relationship with her son, because I won't let her treat you like this anymore, Emily. Security team or no security team." I wanted to believe him. More than anything, I wanted to believe that this time would be different. But experience had taught me to prepare for all contingencies, especially when dealing with someone as determined as Patricia Wilson. "I hope you're right," I said, squeezing his hand. "Just be prepared for her to say whatever she thinks you want to hear in the moment. Your mother is nothing if not adaptable when her social standing is at risk." David nodded grimly. "Trust me, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. I've had a lifetime of experience." After he left for his lunch meeting, I tried to focus on work. We were in final negotiations for a major contract with a multinational tech firm that would expand Sentinel's operations into the California market. But my mind kept returning to David, sitting across from his parents in the Wilson Investments conference room, finally challenging the family dynamics that had shaped him since childhood. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Chen. "How are you holding up after last night?" Michael and I are still processing everything that happened. The Chens had been shocked by Patricia's behavior at the anniversary dinner. Despite my warnings over the years about my mother-in-law's true nature, they had always given her the benefit of the doubt, assuming her cool politeness was just a different communication style rather than thinly veiled contempt. "I'm fine," I texted back. "David is meeting with his parents right now to establish some boundaries." Jessica's response was immediate. "Good. It's about time. That woman needs to recognize what an amazing daughter-in-law she has." I smiled at Jessica's unwavering support. Though she and Michael had fostered me for less than a year when I was 15, they had maintained contact throughout my college years and had enthusiastically reconnected when they recognized me in that Seattle Business Journal feature. Unlike most of my foster placements, the Chens had genuinely cared. They had simply been overwhelmed by my teenage anger and trauma responses, exacerbated by years in the system before I reached them. "Want to meet for coffee later?" Jessica texted. "I have a free period after 3 p.m. Can't today. Big contract negotiations. Rain check? Absolutely. And Emily, I was so proud of you last night. Not just for standing your ground, but for doing it with such dignity." Her words warmed me. The Chens had been among the few people who had consistently believed in me. Jessica had helped me apply for college scholarships when my high school guidance counselor had suggested I look into trade schools instead. Michael had taught me basic computer repair, sparking my interest in technology that eventually led to my cybersecurity degree. I was composing a reply when Marcus Williams, my head of security operations, appeared in my office doorway. His expression was professionally neutral, but I knew him well enough to recognize the tension in his stance. "Everything okay, Marcus?" I asked, setting down my phone. "We've detected some unusual activity that I thought you should be aware of," he said, crossing to my desk and placing a tablet in front of me. "Someone initiated a comprehensive background search on you this morning. Not the usual due diligence kind that we see from potential clients, but something more invasive." I frowned, scanning the data on the screen. Origin: a private investigation firm frequently employed by high-net-worth families in the Seattle area. Primarily for vetting potential employees, investigating possible fraud, and... He hesitated. "And?" I prompted, already suspecting where this was heading. "And examining the backgrounds of individuals marrying into wealthy families," Marcus finished. Usually retroactively when there are concerns about asset division during divorce proceedings. I leaned back in my chair, a cold certainty settling in my stomach. "Patricia Wilson." It wasn't a question, but Marcus nodded confirmation. The search was initiated from an IP address associated with a Wilson family property. Not the main residence, but a vacation home in the San Juan Islands. "The one with no cell service where they typically conduct sensitive business discussions," I said, familiar with the Wilson family's operational security through David. "She's being cautious." Marcus nodded again. "The search is comprehensive. Foster care records, academic transcripts, previous employment, financial history, property ownership, and business filings for Sentinel Shield." "Looking for leverage," I murmured, more to myself than to Marcus. "Or vulnerabilities." "Yes, ma'am. Given the timing, following last night's incident, I thought you should be informed immediately." I studied the data trail on the tablet, noting the specific areas of interest in the search parameters. Patricia wasn't just looking for general background information. She was specifically targeting my grandmother, property ownership related, to the pendant, and Sentinel Shield's intellectual property filings. "She's still after the pendant and the logo," I said, feeling a mixture of anger and weary resignation. "Last night's setback hasn't deterred her at all." Marcus shifted slightly, his professional demeanor momentarily giving way to obvious discomfort. "There's more." The firm conducting the investigation also made inquiries about Sentinel's client list and our security protocols. These aren't typical background check parameters. This was no longer just a personal attack. Patricia was targeting my company, the entity I had built from nothing, that employed over 60 people, that secured the assets and safety of dozens of high-profile clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. "She's looking for weaknesses in our business model," I said, my voice hardening. "Potential vulnerabilities she could exploit or expose." "That would be my assessment as well," Marcus agreed. "We've already implemented countermeasures to protect our systems and client data, but I wanted you to be personally aware of the situation." I nodded, grateful once again for Marcus's thoroughness. I had hired him 3 years earlier, poaching him from a major tech company's security division with the promise of greater autonomy and a significant equity stake in Sentinel. He had never once given me reason to regret that decision. "Thank you, Marcus. Keep monitoring the situation and alert me to any escalation, and..." I hesitated, weighing my next words carefully. "Prepare a complete dossier on Patricia and Robert Wilson's financial and social connections. Nothing invasive or illegal, but a comprehensive overview of their public dealings and relationships." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, the closest he ever came to expressing surprise. "Preparing for contingencies? Always," I confirmed. "I hope David's conversation with his parents today resolves this situation, but history suggests we should be prepared for continued conflict." After Marcus left, I sat staring out at the lake, watching a pleasure boat cut a clean white wake across the calm surface. Patricia's move was calculated but predictable. When confronted publicly, she had retreated tactically only to launch a more subtle counterattack. The timing suggested she hadn't even waited to hear what David had to say at their lunch meeting before initiating her response. My phone rang. David's ringtone. I took a deep breath before answering. How did it go? Better than I expected in some ways, worse in others, he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Can you meet me at Pioneer Square in about an hour? I could use some fresh air and I'd rather not discuss this over the phone. Pioneer Square was our spot, where we had gone for coffee on our first date, where he had proposed on a rainy Seattle evening, the historic heart of the city we both loved, despite approaching it from vastly different backgrounds. Of course, I agreed. The usual bench by the pergola? Perfect. And Emily? His voice softened. I love you. That's the one thing that hasn't changed in all of this. After we disconnected, I sat for a moment, absorbing the complex emotions in his voice. Then I called Jessica Chen to cancel our rain check coffee. Something in David's tone told me this wouldn't be a quick conversation at Pioneer Square. Everything okay? Jessica asked, concern evident in her voice. I'm not sure, I answered. Honestly, David just had his confrontation with his parents, and he wants to meet to discuss it in person. That doesn't sound promising, Jessica said. Do you want Michael and me to be on standby? We could meet you afterward if you need support. Her immediate offer of help touched me deeply. The Chens had never fully understood the rarefied social world of the Wilsons, but they had always recognized the emotional toll it took on me. I'll let you know, I promised. But I think this is something David and I need to work through together, first. An hour later, I found David exactly where I expected, seated on our usual bench in Pioneer Square, 2 paper cups from our favorite local coffee shop waiting on the bench beside him. He looked exhausted, his normally perfect posture slumped slightly, his tie loosened in a way Patricia would have found appalling. I sat beside him, accepting the coffee he offered. That bad? He gave a hollow laugh. Let's just say I now understand why high-level diplomatic negotiations sometimes take years. Tell me, I said simply. David took a long sip of his coffee before responding. My father was receptive, embarrassed about last night, willing to acknowledge that Mother's behavior has been inappropriate. He even suggested family counseling, if you can believe it. And your mother? Masterful, David said, a note of bitter admiration in his voice. She apologized for her momentary overreaction at dinner, blamed it on prednisone for her arthritis affecting her emotional regulation, and then pivoted to expressing concern about how your security team's presence might have traumatized the restaurant staff. I wasn't surprised. Patricia was an expert at deflection and reframing, techniques that had served her well in Seattle's competitive social hierarchy. The medical excuse was a new touch, though. She agreed to respect my boundaries going forward, David continued, but with certain reasonable caveats about family traditions and proper protocols. When I pressed for specifics, she became emotional about feeling unappreciated for all her efforts to integrate you into Wilson family culture. The victim becomes the perpetrator, I murmured, recognizing the classic tactic. David nodded grimly. By the end of lunch, somehow I was the one apologizing for not being more understanding of her perspective, while she magnanimously agreed to try harder to make you feel welcome. I couldn't help but smile at the predictability of it all. And let me guess, not once did she actually commit to specific behavioral changes or acknowledge the pattern of exclusion and undermining. Not in any way that would stand up to scrutiny, David confirmed. It was all vague assurances and emotional appeals. Even my father seemed frustrated by the end, though he's had decades of practice hiding his reactions to Mother's manipulations. I took a thoughtful sip of my coffee, debating whether to tell David about the investigation Patricia had initiated that morning. He looked so defeated already, sitting in the watery Seattle sunlight that had broken through the cloud cover. "There's something you should know," I said finally. "Your mother hired investigators this morning to dig into my background and Sentinel's operations. She's still after the pendant and the logo, along with whatever else she might find to use against me." David's expression shifted from defeated to furious in an instant. Before our lunch meeting, while she was sitting there giving me tearful assurances about respecting boundaries? "Apparently," I confirmed. "Marcus detected the activity and traced it back to your family's San Juan property." He set his coffee down with such force that some of it sloshed onto the bench between us. "That's it. I'm done. I've spent 10 years trying to reconcile my relationship with my parents with my life with you, and it's clear now that's never going to happen. At least not with Mother." I placed a calming hand on his arm. "David, think carefully. Your parents have been central to your life for 38 years. I don't want you making irrevocable decisions in the heat of anger." "This isn't about anger," he said, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "It's about finally accepting reality. My mother will never see you as an equal, never respect what you've built, never stop trying to assert Wilson dominance over every aspect of our lives. And I can't keep pretending that with enough patience and goodwill, she'll magically transform into the supportive mother-in-law you deserve." His words resonated with the conclusion I had reached myself years ago, but had never pushed David to accept. Patricia Wilson operated from a worldview that ranked people according to birth, wealth, and social connection. In that hierarchy, I would always be deficient, a former foster child who had built success rather than inheriting it, who valued achievement over pedigree. "What are you proposing?" I asked quietly. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from moments of difficult decision-making throughout our relationship. Distance. Clear, unambiguous distance. No more weekly dinners, no more holiday obligations, no more pretending we're one big happy family with a few communication issues. I studied his face, seeing the painful resolution there. For all his frustration with Patricia over the years, David loved his parents. Creating this separation would cost him deeply. "And your father? You said he was receptive to change." David's expression softened slightly. "I'll maintain individual contact with Dad. He's never been the primary driver of the conflict, and I think he genuinely respects what you've accomplished with Sentinel." I nodded, considering this approach. "And when your mother inevitably tries to use your father as a conduit to re-establish connection without addressing the underlying issues?" "I'll be vigilant," David promised. "No more benefit of the doubt. No more second chances based on superficial apologies. I've enabled her behavior for too long, telling myself it was family loyalty when really it was just conflict avoidance." We sat in silence for a few moments, the sounds of Pioneer Square flowing around us, tourists exploring the historic district, office workers hurrying between meetings, street musicians playing in the late afternoon light. This place had witnessed so many pivotal moments in our relationship, and now it was witnessing perhaps the most significant shift since our wedding day. "There's something else," David said finally, his voice quieter. "Something I've been considering for a while, but last night's confrontation clarified for me." I turned to face him fully, recognizing the weight in his tone. "What is it?" "I want to leave Wilson Investments," he said. "Not immediately. That would be irresponsible to our clients and the team I've built there. But I've been approached about a position with Meridian Capital that would allow me to focus on the kind of impact investing I'm passionate about, rather than constantly navigating family expectations." This was unexpected. David had worked at Wilson Investments since graduating from Harvard Business School, gradually taking on more responsibility until he was overseeing their entire sustainable investment division. The firm was as much a part of his identity as the Wilson name itself. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Your work at Wilson has been groundbreaking in getting traditional investors to consider environmental and social impact metrics." He nodded, a new certainty in his expression. "I'm sure. Being a Wilson at Wilson Investments means I'll never fully escape my mother's influence or expectations. And truthfully, I think I've stayed this long partly because leaving felt like a betrayal of family legacy. Exactly the kind of thinking that's kept me from fully supporting you against my mother's manipulations. I took his hand, feeling the slight tremor that betrayed his inner conflict despite his resolute words. I support whatever decision you make, David, but I want it to be about what you truly want for your career, not just a reaction to the current situation with your parents. It's both, he admitted. The situation with Mother crystallized something I've felt for years, that I'm living a life partially defined by others' expectations rather than fully embracing my own path. You built Sentinel Shield according to your vision, not someone else's template. I want that same authenticity in my professional life. His words stirred a complicated mix of emotions in me: pride in his self-reflection, hope for our future, concern about the practical and emotional implications of such significant changes in his life all at once. "What about your father?" I asked. "How will he take this news on top of your decision to distance yourself from your mother?" David's expression clouded. "That's the hardest part. Dad built Wilson Investments from what his father started. It's his life's work. He's always assumed I would eventually take over completely when he retires." "Will this damage your relationship with him?" I pressed, knowing how much David valued his father's approval despite the complications of their family dynamics. "Possibly," David acknowledged, "though I think he'll understand better than Mother will. He's always emphasized making principled decisions, even when they're difficult." I squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens, whatever you decide, I'm with you. Just make sure you're doing this for the right reasons, not as a reaction to last night, or out of some misplaced need to prove your loyalty to me." David leaned forward, his gaze intent. "Emily, do you remember what you said to Patricia last night? That you weren't climbing anywhere? That you'd built your own mountain?" I nodded. "That's what I want," he said simply. "Not to climb the mountain? My parents designated for me, but to build something that truly reflects my values. Something I can be proud of in the way you're proud of Sentinel." His words resonated with something fundamental in my own journey: the fierce determination that had driven me from foster care to founding Sentinel Shield, the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others, the courage to forge a path where none existed before. "Then do it," I said. "Build your mountain. Just be prepared for the resistance you'll face, not just from your mother, but from others who benefit from you remaining exactly where you are." David's smile held equal parts determination and weariness. "I've had 10 years of watching you navigate resistance from my family and succeed despite it. I think I've learned a thing or two about standing my ground." As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across Pioneer Square, we sat together on our bench, planning a future neither of us had fully anticipated when we'd woken that morning. The confrontation at our anniversary dinner had catalyzed changes long in the making, forcing honesty where polite fiction had prevailed, demanding action where patient endurance had been the norm. I didn't tell David that day about the dossier. I had asked Marcus to prepare on his parents' financial and social connections. Some preparations were better kept private, some contingencies better left unspoken. I hoped we wouldn't need that information, that David's decisive stand would be enough to reset the dynamics with his family. But hope was not a strategy. And if there was one thing my journey from foster care to CEO had taught me, it was that true security came from anticipating threats before they materialized, from being prepared for all possible scenarios, especially when dealing with someone as determined and resourceful as Patricia Wilson. As we walked hand in hand back to our car, I touched the pendant at my throat, feeling its familiar weight against my skin. It represented not just my connection to my grandmother, but everything I had built from that small inheritance: my company, my identity, my unwavering refusal to be diminished by others' expectations. Whatever Patricia's next move might be, whatever challenges lay ahead in David's proposed transformations, I would face them with the same resolve that had carried me from a frightened foster child to the woman I was today. And this time, it seemed, I would truly have David standing beside me rather than caught in the middle, a partner in the fullest sense of the word, ready to build his own mountain alongside mine. 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner confrontation, Sentinel Shield secured the California expansion deal, a watershed moment that would double our operational footprint and increase our workforce by nearly 40%. The executive team, gathered in our Seattle headquarters conference room, champagne flutes in hand as I signed the final documents with a fountain pen Jessica Chen had given me when I graduated college, one of the few gifts I'd kept from those lean years. To Sentinel's next chapter, Michael Reeves, my COO, toasted as I set the pen down, and to Emily Johnson, who told us 5 years ago that we'd be a West Coast security leader by 2025. The team cheered, but I noticed Marcus Williams standing slightly apart, his expression professionally neutral despite the celebration. Something was off. I'd worked with him long enough to recognize the subtle tells, the way he checked his watch, the slight tension in his shoulders. I made my way to him as the others broke into smaller conversations, already discussing implementation timelines and personnel assignments for the California offices. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly. Marcus glanced around to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. "We've detected another sweep of company records, more sophisticated than the first attempt. They accessed our public filing history and some periphery systems before our countermeasures kicked in." I maintained my smile for anyone watching, but my voice hardened. "Patricia again?" "Different approach, same origin," he confirmed. This time they went through more sophisticated channels, a corporate intelligence firm that specializes in pre-acquisition research. They're presenting as potential investors. Timeline? Started 3 days ago, escalated this morning, coinciding with the industry announcement about our California expansion. I nodded, processing this information against the broader context of Patricia's behavior since our confrontation. She had maintained a strategic distance. No calls, no accidental encounters at David's work events, no third-party messages through mutual acquaintances. The cooling-off period had seemed promising, especially as David had begun serious discussions with Meridian Capital about his potential new position. But I knew Patricia Wilson better than to believe she had simply accepted defeat. This was textbook: retreat, regroup, approach from a different angle with improved intelligence. The timing with our California announcement couldn't be coincidental. "Lock down everything sensitive," I instructed Marcus. "Prepare a complete security audit and alert the executive team, quietly. Frame it as standard procedure for our expansion. Preparation already initiated," he assured me. "But there's something else. Robert Wilson made a substantial stock purchase yesterday, not in Sentinel directly, but in TechGuard Solutions." This was significant. TechGuard was one of our primary competitors, a larger but less innovative firm that had tried unsuccessfully to acquire Sentinel Shield 2 years earlier. "How substantial?" "Enough to give him a seat on their advisory board if he wants it," Marcus said. "The transaction was conducted through a shell company, but we traced it back to Wilson Investments' private equity division." I took a measured sip of champagne, mind racing with implications. Robert had seemed genuinely apologetic after the anniversary dinner confrontation. David believed his father was finally separating himself from Patricia's manipulations. But this move suggested otherwise, or perhaps indicated that family loyalty ultimately outweighed whatever respect he claimed to have for me and my company. "Does David know?" Marcus shook his head. "The transaction was finalized this morning. It hasn't been made public yet. Keep this between us for now," I decided. "I need to speak with David first, understand what he knows about his father's investment strategy before we draw conclusions." The celebration continued around us, my team rightfully proud of the milestone we'd achieved. The California expansion represented everything I'd worked toward since founding Sentinel: growth, innovation, recognition in the industry as more than just a regional player. I should have been fully present in this moment of triumph, but instead found myself calculating Patricia Wilson's next move in a game I had never wanted to play. That evening, I arrived home to find David in the kitchen, preparing dinner with focused intensity, slicing vegetables with more force than necessary, the set of his shoulders revealing tension I recognized immediately. Something had happened. "Congratulations on the California deal," he said, looking up briefly before returning to his aggressive dicing of bell peppers. "That's huge for Sentinel." "Thanks," I replied, setting my bag down and studying him. "Though you don't seem particularly celebratory about it." David sighed, setting down the knife. "Sorry. I am proud of you, Emily. Truly. It's just been..." He gestured vaguely with one hand. "A day." I moved to the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of white wine. "Want to talk about it?" He watched me pour 2 glasses, his expression troubled. "Dad made a major investment in TechGuard Solutions yesterday. Did you know?" So he had learned about it. I handed him a glass, choosing my words carefully. "Marcus informed me this afternoon. I was waiting to discuss it with you, to understand if it was a routine investment decision or something more targeted." David's laugh held no humor. "Oh, it's targeted all right. Dad claims it's just diversification in the security sector, given the industry's growth projections. But the timing, right as you announce your California expansion? That's not coincidence." I leaned against the counter, watching him resume his vegetable preparation with slightly less aggression. "What does your father gain by investing in our competitor? Beyond the obvious financial returns if TechGuard performs well." "Information," David said immediately. "Advisory board access means insight into TechGuard's strategy, market positioning, potential acquisition targets." He met my eyes directly, including their renewed interest in Sentinel Shield. This was worse than I'd anticipated. TechGuard is making another play? David nodded grimly. "Their CEO approached me today. Very casual. Very just between us. Floating the idea that with Sentinel's expansion, it might be the perfect time to consider a strategic partnership rather than competing directly in the California market." "Partnership," I repeated, the euphemism transparent. "They want to absorb us before we become a bigger threat." "Essentially," David confirmed. "And the timing with Dad's investment is too perfect to be coincidence. He's giving them insider access to Wilson Investments' portfolio companies, several of which are your clients, while positioning himself to benefit financially if they succeed in acquiring Sentinel." I took a long sip of wine, digesting this new development. "And your mother?" David's expression darkened further. "Suspiciously uninvolved, which isn't like her at all. She hasn't mentioned you or Sentinel once in the past 3 weeks, according to Dad. She's suddenly fascinated with renovating their vacation property in the San Juans, the same property used to initiate that first background check on you." The picture was becoming clearer. Robert's investment was the visible move in a coordinated strategy. Patricia was working behind the scenes, maintaining plausible deniability while orchestrating a more sophisticated attack on my company rather than just my personal standing. "This changes the calculus," I said quietly. "This isn't just social maneuvering anymore. They're directly targeting Sentinel's business interests." David set down his knife with deliberate care. I confronted Dad about it, asked him point blank if this investment was Mother's idea, if they were deliberately undermining your company's expansion. And he denied it, of course, said I was being paranoid, that business and family were separate considerations. David's voice tightened with anger. When I pressed him, He said something that confirmed everything, that sometimes business opportunities align with family interests in fortunate ways. I moved to the window overlooking the lake, watching darkness settle over the water as I considered our options. The Wilsons had shifted from social warfare to economic tactics, more dangerous, but also more concrete, and therefore easier to counter with proper strategy. I'm accelerating my discussions with Meridian Capital, David said, coming to stand beside me. I can't stay at Wilson Investments while my father is actively working against your company. I turned to face him, recognizing the cost of this decision. Despite the complications, David loved his work at Wilson Investments, had built his professional identity there. Leaving would mean abandoning not just his position, but the trajectory he had planned for his entire career. Are you sure? I asked. Wilson Investments is your legacy too. His expression softened slightly as he reached for my hand. Emily, you once told me that real legacy isn't what's handed to you, but what you build yourself. Sentinel's shield is your legacy, something you created from nothing but determination and vision. I want my professional legacy to reflect my values, not just my family name. His words echoed what he had said in Pioneer Square weeks earlier, but now they carried the weight of concrete action rather than just intention. I squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of pride in his evolution from the conflict-avoidant man I had married to someone willing to make difficult choices based on principle. What's your timeline with Meridian? They've offered to accelerate the process, he said. I could transition within 30 days if I accept their terms. The position would focus exclusively on impact investing, environmental and social governance, funds with measurable outcomes beyond just financial returns. It's everything I've been trying to build at Wilson, but without the constraints of family expectations. I nodded, already calculating how this would affect our strategy against Patricia and Robert's maneuvers. David leaving Wilson Investments would limit their access to information about his activities, but it would also potentially alienate him further from family resources and intelligence. There's something else you should know, I said. Deciding transparency was essential given the escalation. Marcus detected another sweep of Sentinel's records, more sophisticated than the first, disguised as investor due diligence. It started 3 days ago, right before your father made his move with TechGuard. David's expression hardened. Coordinated attacks. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. The subtlety is in the methodology, not the timing, I corrected. Your father's investment is publicly defensible as normal business strategy. The record sweep is disguised as standard investor research. If confronted, they have plausible deniability for both actions individually, while the coordination between them remains invisible to outside observers. But not to us, David said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Because we're positioned to see both sides of the equation. Exactly. I moved back to the counter, picking up my wine glass, which gives us an advantage they might not have anticipated. David studied me with growing interest. You have a counter move in mind. It wasn't a question. In the weeks since the anniversary dinner, our dynamic had shifted subtly but significantly. David had begun to see me not just as his wife, who needed protection from his mother's social machinations, but as a strategic thinker in my own right, someone who had built a security empire by anticipating threats and neutralizing them before they materialized. Several, I confirmed. But first, we need more information about TechGuard's specific intentions. If they're planning another acquisition attempt, we need to know their timeline and approach. David's expression shifted to thoughtful calculation. The same expression I'd seen when he was working through complex investment scenarios at Wilson. I could use my position while I'm still there to gather intelligence. Dad brought me into TechGuard discussions last year when they first expressed interest in Sentinel. I shook my head immediately. Too risky. If your father suspects you're Gathering information to counter their strategy, it could accelerate their timeline. We need a more indirect approach. We spent the remainder of the evening developing a response strategy, dinner preparations forgotten as we worked through scenarios at the kitchen island. This was a new dimension to our marriage, partners not just in life but in tactical planning, against a common adversary. The anniversary dinner confrontation had catalyzed not just David's awakening to his mother's manipulations, but a deeper alignment between us as equals in a complex battle. The next morning, I called an emergency, meeting with my executive team, excluding only the newest members whose loyalty I couldn't completely verify. In Sentinel's secure conference room, with signal jammers active and monitors displaying our company's current security protocols, I laid out the situation in clear terms. We have credible intelligence that TechGuard Solutions is preparing another acquisition attempt, I began, meeting each person's gaze directly. This time with support from significant outside investors, including Wilson Investments. A murmur ran through the room. Everyone present knew about my relationship with the Wilson family. The anniversary dinner confrontation had been too public for the details not to have circulated among Seattle's business community. This is both a business challenge and a personal one, I acknowledged, preferring transparency with my core team. My in-laws appear to be supporting TechGuard's efforts, which gives them additional intelligence about our operations and client relationships. Michael Reeves, my COO, leaned forward. How does this affect our California expansion? Should we delay the timeline? Quite the opposite, I replied, pulling up our strategic growth plan on the main screen. We're accelerating deployment. I want our Los Angeles and San Francisco offices operational within 45 days instead of the planned 90. That's aggressive, Reeves cautioned. We'd need to expedite hiring, training, client onboarding, everything. Precisely, I said. While TechGuard and their investors are planning their approach based on our published timeline, we'll establish our California presence at twice the expected speed. By the time they're ready to move, we'll already be entrenched in the market. Leena Sharma, our chief financial officer, studied the projections with a professional skepticism I had always valued. The capital expenditure acceleration will impact our quarterly numbers. Shareholders might get nervous. I've anticipated that, I acknowledged, which brings me to the second part of our strategy. We're going to announce a strategic partnership of our own with Axiom Technologies. This generated more pronounced reactions. Axiom was a rising star in the cybersecurity space, with proprietary artificial intelligence tools that complemented Sentinel's physical security expertise. We had discussed potential collaboration in the past, but nothing formal had materialized. Axiom's CEO Elena Vasquez is an old friend from my early days in the industry, I explained. We've been in preliminary discussions about integration, possibilities for their AI threat detection system with our physical security protocols. I'm proposing we accelerate those discussions into a formal partnership announcement within 2 weeks. Marcus Williams, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room, spoke up. A partnership with Axiom would significantly complicate TechGuard's acquisition calculations. Their AI platform would make us a less straightforward target, give us access to additional capital resources without diluting existing shareholder value, Leena added, seeing the strategic advantage. Clever. There's more, I continued, bringing up another screen displaying Sentinel's client portfolio, alongside TechGuard's. I want a targeted outreach to TechGuard's top enterprise clients, offering security audits at preferential rates. Focus on the ones most likely to be concerned about the redundancies and service disruptions that typically follow acquisitions. Michael Reeves smiled slowly as he understood the approach. Creating anxiety among their client base about a potential acquisition. That's playing hardball, Emily. They initiated this game, I replied evenly. I'm simply ensuring we maintain our competitive position while they're distracted with acquisition planning. The meeting continued for another hour as we refined the strategy and assigned responsibility for each component. When the team dispersed to begin implementation, Marcus remained behind, waiting until the room had cleared before speaking. "There's something you didn't share with the group," he observed, his tone neutral, but his eyes questioning. I nodded, appreciating his perception. "David is leaving Wilson Investments for a position with Meridian Capital. The transition will happen within 30 days. Marcus absorbed this information with a slight raise of his eyebrows, his equivalent of profound surprise. "That's a significant development. How does it factor into our strategy?" "It's a personal decision David has made based on his own professional goals," I said, maintaining the official narrative we had agreed upon. "But it will have the additional benefit of limiting the Wilson family's access to information about his activities and, by extension, mine. And the potential downside of removing our primary intelligence source about their intentions," Marcus noted pragmatically. "A calculated risk," I acknowledged. But David's continued presence at Wilson Investments was becoming untenable. The conflict of interest was too profound, especially with Robert's investment in TechGuard. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Will you want additional personal security protocols during this transition period? The Wilsons may perceive David's departure as an escalation." I considered this carefully. Patricia and Robert had already demonstrated their willingness to target my company as well as my personal standing. David's resignation from the family firm would represent not just a professional change, but a public declaration of independence from Wilson family control. Yes, I decided, discreet surveillance on the lake house and enhanced monitoring of my communication channels. And I want a complete security review of David's digital footprint before he submits his resignation. Ensure there are no vulnerabilities they could exploit. "Already in progress," Marcus assured me. "And the Chens? Should we extend monitoring to them as well?" I hadn't considered that Patricia might target Jessica and Michael Chen, the closest thing to family I had besides David. But Marcus's question highlighted a potential vulnerability I couldn't ignore. The Chens were civically engaged, socially, connected through Jessica's work as a high school counselor, but utterly unprepared for the sophisticated tactics the Wilsons might employ. "Basic monitoring only," I instructed. "I don't want to alarm them unnecessarily. But yes, establish a security baseline so we can detect any unusual inquiries or approaches." After Marcus departed, I remained in the conference room, studying the strategic plan we had developed, the acceleration of our California expansion, the partnership with Axiom, the targeted outreach to TechGuard clients, all solid business moves that would strengthen Sentinel Shield's market position regardless of the Wilsons' involvement. But I was under no illusions about the personal cost of this escalation. David's decision to leave Wilson Investments would permanently alter his relationship with his parents, especially his father. Robert Wilson had been grooming David as his successor for nearly 15 years, investing not just professional mentorship, but emotional capital in his son's development within the family firm. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Meeting with Dad at 2 p.m. to discuss my transition. Meridian contract ready for review when you get home tonight." I texted back, "Good luck. Remember, this is about your professional growth, not just a reaction to recent events." His response came quickly. "I know. For the first time, I'm making a decision based on what I want to build, not what others expect me to maintain." Feels right. I smiled at his words, feeling a surge of pride mixed with lingering concern. The David I had married would have been paralyzed by the prospect of disappointing his father, of stepping away from the predetermined path that had been laid out for him since childhood. This evolution represented genuine growth, painful but necessary. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Jessica Chen. "Lunch tomorrow? Michael and I have news we'd like to share with you first before telling others." The Chens rarely reached out midweek, knowing my schedule was typically packed with back-to-back meetings. Their message sparked both curiosity and a faint unease, given the timing amidst all the other developments. "Of course," I replied. "Noon at Raconteur Cafe?" Jessica's confirmation came with a smiley emoji, characteristically warm despite the cryptic nature of her initial message. Whatever news they wanted to share, it seemed to be positive rather than concerning. I turned my attention back to the strategic plan spread across the conference room table, mentally calculating timelines and resource allocations for our accelerated initiatives. The California expansion would strain our operations team, but cement our position as a major industry player rather than just a regional success story. The Axiom partnership would enhance our technological capabilities while sending a clear message to the market about our strategic direction. If Patricia and Robert Wilson thought they could undermine Sentinel Shield through backroom deals and corporate espionage, they were about to discover how thoroughly I had prepared for exactly this type of challenge. I hadn't built a security empire by being naive about potential threats, even those that came disguised as family. The following day, I arrived at Raconteur Cafe a few minutes early, selecting a quiet corner table with good sightlines to both the entrance and the kitchen, as a habit developed through years of security consciousness, rather than any specific concern about this meeting. The cafe was a favorite among Seattle's tech professionals, with excellent coffee and a noise level that made private conversations possible without electronic eavesdropping. Jessica and Michael Chen arrived precisely at noon, both looking slightly more polished than usual, Jessica in a crisp blouse rather than her typical casual teacher attire, Michael wearing a sports jacket over his polo shirt. Their body language radiated suppressed excitement, confirming my impression that their news was positive. After warm hugs and ordering lunch, Jessica reached across the table to grasp my hand, her expression a mixture of joy and nervousness. "So," she began, glancing at Michael, who nodded encouragement. "Remember how we always talked about opening that educational consulting firm when we retired? Helping kids like you navigate the college application process, especially those without family support?" I nodded, recalling many evening conversations around their kitchen table during my brief time in their foster care. It had been Jessica who first recognized my academic potential despite my spotty school record, who insisted I could aim for college scholarship opportunities rather than just immediate employment after high school. "Well," Jessica continued, her excitement building, "Michael's company offered an early retirement package, and my school district has a sabbatical program I qualify for. We're doing it, opening Chen Educational Pathways this summer." I felt a genuine smile spread across my face, the first unguarded joy I'd experienced in weeks of strategic planning and family conflict. "That's wonderful. You two have talked about this for years." "We have," Michael confirmed, his normally reserved demeanor animated with enthusiasm. "But there's more to it. We want to establish a scholarship fund specifically for foster youth and first-generation college students. And we'd like to name it after you, the Emily Johnson Achievement Scholarship." I stared at them, momentarily speechless. In all my years of building Sentinel Shield, accumulating professional accolades and financial success, nothing had touched me quite like this gesture from the Chens. They had been in my life for less than a year during my adolescence, yet they had seen something in me worth nurturing, worth believing in, when so many others had simply processed me through an overcrowded system. I don't know what to say," I managed finally, emotion making my voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "That's incredibly meaningful." Jessica squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You were our first foster placement, Emily. We weren't prepared for the challenges, didn't have the support systems we needed to help you properly. But watching you build your life, your company, knowing we played even a small part in that journey, it's been one of our greatest joys." Michael nodded agreement. "Your success story is exactly what we want to help create for other kids in similar situations. Not everyone will found a multi-million-dollar security firm, of course. He smiled wryly. But everyone deserves the chance to build their own path based on their potential, not their circumstances. We'd like your input on the scholarship criteria, Jessica added. And if you'd be willing, maybe occasional mentorship for some of the recipients. No pressure. We know how busy you are with Sentinel and the new California offices. I looked at these two people who had believed in me long before I had accumulated external markers of success, who had maintained connection despite my teenage anger and withdrawal, who had celebrated each of my achievements without ever taking credit for their early guidance. I'd be honored, I said simply, both for the scholarship naming and the mentorship role. And I'd like to establish a matching fund from Sentinel Shield. Whatever you raise for the scholarship program, we'll match dollar for dollar. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. Emily, that's incredibly generous. We were hoping you might make a small donation to help us launch, but a matching fund? It's not just generosity, I explained, thinking of the contrast between the Chen's straightforward support and the Wilsons' complicated legacy expectations. It's good business. Sentinel needs talented, resilient people who understand security from diverse perspectives. Supporting foster youth and first-generation students creates a potential talent pipeline while addressing a real need. Win-win. As we discussed their plans in more detail over lunch, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The constant strategic calculation, the defensive positioning that had dominated my thinking since the anniversary dinner. Confrontation. The Chen's project represented something uncomplicated and purely positive amidst the tension with the Wilsons. A reminder of why I had built Sentinel Shield in the first place. To create security in its broadest sense. To protect what mattered most. When my phone buzzed with a message from David, I expected an update about his meeting with Robert. Instead, I found myself staring at words that sent ice through my veins. Mother knows about the Axiom partnership discussions. She just, called Elena Vasquez directly, representing herself as an interested investor with concerns about Axiom's strategic direction. We have a problem. I managed to maintain my composure through the remainder of lunch, promising the Chens my full support for their educational initiative and arranging a follow-up meeting with Sentinel's community engagement team. But as I slid into the back seat of my waiting car, I called David directly. How did she find out? I asked without preamble when he answered. The Axiom discussions were completely confidential, just my executive team and Elena's. I don't know, David admitted, his voice tight with frustration, but she positioned herself as a concerned potential investor. Suggested that Axiom's market valuation might be affected by partnership with a company currently under scrutiny from certain regulatory bodies. What regulatory scrutiny? I demanded. Sentinel has a perfect compliance record across all jurisdictions. There isn't any, David confirmed, but Elena doesn't know that. Mother implied that her connections at the Commerce Department had mentioned ongoing discussions about Sentinel's security protocols for certain government-adjacent clients. I closed my eyes briefly, recognizing the elegant simplicity of Patricia's approach. No direct accusations, no verifiable claims, just the suggestion of regulatory interest, planted with precisely the right person at the right time to maximum effect. Has Elena pulled back from the partnership discussions? I asked, already calculating alternative strategies if Axiom became hesitant. Not yet, David said. She called me directly after Mother's approach, which is how I found out about it. She's understandably concerned, but said your track record gives her confidence. She just wants assurance that there aren't actual regulatory issues on the horizon. I nodded, though David couldn't see it. I'll call her immediately, provide complete transparency about our compliance status and regulatory relationships. We can accelerate the due diligence process to give her additional confidence. There's something else, David added, hesitation evident in his voice. My meeting with Dad about leaving Wilson Investments. it didn't go as expected. I had been bracing for Robert's anger, his sense of betrayal at David's decision to leave the family firm. Was it worse than we anticipated? No, David said slowly. That's the strange part. He was understanding, almost supportive once. I explained my interest in Meridian's impact investment focus. He said he respected my decision to forge my own path and offered to facilitate a smooth transition. This was unexpected and concerning. Robert Wilson was nothing if not strategic in his thinking. His apparent acceptance of David's resignation didn't align with his recent investment in TechGuard and the coordinated efforts to undermine Sentinel Shield. Did he mention the TechGuard investment or anything related to Sentinel? I asked, suspicion growing. Not directly, David replied. But he did make an odd comment as I was leaving. Said something about how family businesses sometimes need to evolve through creative restructuring. And when I asked what he meant, he just smiled and said we'd discuss it more at Sunday dinner. Sunday dinner, the weekly Wilson family tradition that David and I had been avoiding since the anniversary confrontation. The implication was clear. Robert expected David to attend, alone, to continue their discussion. It's a trap, I said flatly. They're separating us strategically, Patricia approaching Elena directly, while Robert tries to isolate you from me during this critical period. David was silent for a moment, processing. You think they're coordinating these moves? That Dad's apparent acceptance of my resignation is part of a larger strategy? I'm certain of it, I replied. The timing is too perfect. Patricia plants seeds of doubt with our key strategic partner, while Robert creates an opening to influence you separately. From me, classic divide and conquer. Another silence, longer this time. When David spoke again, his voice had a new quality, a hardened resolve I had rarely heard from him when discussing his parents. You're right, he said finally. I've been giving them the benefit of the doubt for too long, seeing their actions in isolation rather than as a coordinated campaign. No more. I felt a surge of pride at his clarity, mixed with regret that it had taken such blatant manipulation to bring him to this realization. What are you going to do about Sunday dinner? Decline, he said firmly, and be explicit about why, that I won't participate in separate discussions that exclude you, especially during this critical business period for Sentinel. As my car pulled up to Sentinel's headquarters, I made a quick decision. No, accept the invitation. What? David's surprise was evident. But you just said, it's a trap, yes, I interrupted. But sometimes the best way to counter a trap is to spring it deliberately, on your own terms. Go to Sunday dinner. Listen to what Robert has to say. But we'll prepare you thoroughly, and you'll be wearing Sentinel's latest passive recording technology. The plan formed rapidly in my mind. Not just a defensive maneuver, but a potential opportunity to gather intelligence about the Wilsons' true intentions. If Robert believed he was speaking to David privately, without my influence, he might reveal crucial details about their strategy against Sentinel. You want me to spy on my father, David said slowly. Not a question, but a realization. I chose my next words carefully, recognizing the moral complexity of what I was proposing. I want you to protect yourself and our future by documenting exactly what's being said when they think you're isolated from me. Not for public use, not for leverage, just for our own clarity about what we're truly facing. The silence that followed felt weighted with all the complicated history between David and his parents, all the layers of loyalty and expectation that had shaped his identity long before I entered his life. Okay, he said finally, his voice steady with newfound resolve. I'll do it. Because whatever they're planning, we need to face it together, with complete information, not just what they choose to show each of us separately. As I ended the call and stepped out of the car, I touched the pendant at my throat, drawing strength from its familiar weight. Patricia Wilson had demanded it at our anniversary dinner. setting in motion this escalating conflict that now threatened not just my personal dignity, but my company's strategic future. What she hadn't realized, what perhaps the Wilsons, with all their generational wealth and social power, couldn't fully comprehend, was that people who build security systems for a living understand threats at a fundamental level. We don't just react to them. We anticipate them, prepare for them, and sometimes, when necessary, we turn them to our advantage. Sunday dinner at the Wilson estate would proceed as planned, but with one crucial difference. This time, we would be the ones gathering intelligence, not just defending against it. Sunday evening arrived with unusual clarity for Seattle in early autumn. I watched David adjust his tie, tension evident in his shoulders as he prepared for dinner at his parents' Mercer Island estate. "The recording device is undetectable," I assured him, straightening his already perfect collar. "It looks like a normal tie clip. Just don't fidget with it." David nodded, his expression a mixture of determination and regret. I never imagined wearing surveillance equipment to dinner with my own parents. I met his gaze directly. This isn't about invading their privacy. It's about protecting ourselves. If tonight's conversation is completely innocent, no one ever needs to know the recording existed. "And if it's not?" he asked quietly. "Then we'll have the information we need to counter whatever they're planning," I replied. "Knowledge is security. That's the foundation Sentinel was built on." He squared his shoulders. "The extraction phrase if things go sideways?" "Caroline's art exhibition next month," I confirmed. "Marcus will call with an urgent client emergency requiring your immediate attention." Marcus and a security team would be stationed near the Wilson estate. A precaution I doubted we'd need, but security meant preparing for unlikely scenarios, not just probable ones. "I still wish you were coming with me," David said. I smiled, slightly. "That would defeat the purpose. They've created this separate conversation to isolate you from my influence. Let them believe they've succeeded." After David left, I activated the secure connection to the recording device. While waiting for him to arrive at his parents' estate, I reviewed the latest intelligence reports. Robert had increased his stake in TechGuard Solutions through carefully structured transactions. Patricia had made 3 separate calls to Elena Vasquez at Axiom Technologies, each framed as friendly investor interest rather than interference. Most concerning was a pattern of outreach to Sentinel's top clients, subtle inquiries about satisfaction, levels, hints about upcoming market changes, suggestions that TechGuard might offer more comprehensive services after its pending strategic reorganization. My secure line rang. Elena Vasquez from Axiom. "Emily," she began without preamble, "I've just declined an invitation to join the Wilson Foundation's Technology Advisory Board. I thought you should know." "When did this invitation come?" I asked, instantly alert. "Yesterday. Hand-delivered to my home with a personal note from Patricia Wilson expressing admiration for Axiom's approach to threat detection." The Wilson Foundation's Technology Advisory Board was prestigious but selective, comprised mainly of established industry veterans with strong connections to old-money tech families. "The timing suggests this isn't coincidental," I observed. "Precisely. My assessment," Elena agreed. "Particularly since Patricia Wilson suddenly appears to be cultivating a friendship with TechGuard CEO James Morrison. They were spotted having lunch at Canlis yesterday, quite visible at a window table. Thank you for letting me know, and for declining the invitation." "Partnership means loyalty, Emily," she replied simply. "Besides, anyone attempting such obvious manipulation clearly underestimates women who've built tech companies from the ground up. We recognize power plays when we see them." I checked the audio feed from David's tie clip. He had arrived at the Wilson estate, the recording capturing the distinctive sound of the ornate door knocker. Patricia's voice came through with perfect clarity. "David, darling, we've missed you these past weeks." The performance in her tone was evident. Warmth carefully modulated to convey maternal affection without acknowledging the tension from their last interaction. "Hello, Mother," David replied, betraying none of the anxiety I knew he felt. "Cook has prepared your favorite, duck confit with cherry reduction. Your father's in the library with drinks." The subtle rustling indicated David moving through the house, followed by ice cubes clinking against crystal. Robert Wilson's voice came next. "Son, glad you could join us tonight." "Dad," David acknowledged. "Scotch?" "Already poured." 18-year Macallan thought the occasion warranted something special. I leaned closer to my monitor as Robert continued. "I've been reflecting on our conversation about your transition from Wilson Investments," he said. "Your mother and I have discussed it at length, and while we were initially surprised by your decision, we've come to see it as potentially beneficial for all parties." "That's not what I expected to hear," David replied, controlled surprise in his voice. "Family. Businesses evolve, son. Each generation must find its own path while honoring the foundation laid before them." The historical revisionism was fascinating. Robert recasting his father's legacy to align with the current situation. "I appreciate your understanding," David replied cautiously. "Meridian's focus on impact investing aligns more closely with my personal values." Robert chuckled, warm on the surface but with an undercurrent I recognized from numerous negotiations. Values evolve too, David. In fact, that's partly what I wanted to discuss tonight. Your mother and I have been reevaluating our approach to certain situations in light of recent events. "What kind of reevaluation?" David asked neutrally. "For one, we recognize that our approach to your relationship with Emily has been perhaps less supportive than it could have been." The understatement was almost comical given the decade of undermining, culminating in Patricia's demand for my grandmother's pendant and their recent coordinated attacks on Sentinel's business interests. "That's certainly true," David replied dryly. "Though less supportive doesn't quite capture the dynamic." Robert cleared his throat. "What matters now is moving forward productively. Which brings me to a proposal I'd like you to consider." "I'm listening," David said. TechGuard Solutions has expressed interest in acquiring Sentinel Shield, as you're aware. Given your wife's resistance to previous overtures, they've been exploring more creative approaches. I've recently taken a position on their advisory board to help facilitate what could be a mutually beneficial arrangement. My hands tightened on the edge of my desk as I listened, the directness of Robert's admission confirming our suspicions. "And what would this mutually beneficial arrangement entail?" David asked steadily. "Rather than a traditional acquisition, TechGuard is prepared to offer a merger of equals," Robert explained. "Sentinel would maintain its brand identity, and Emily would retain her position as CEO of the Sentinel division, reporting to TechGuard's board. The combined entity would be positioned to dominate the West Coast security market." "How exactly is this different from the acquisition attempt Emily already declined 2 years ago?" David asked. "Other than the terminology?" Robert sighed audibly. "The difference is in the governance structure and the preservation of Emily's role. She built Sentinel Shield from nothing, an achievement worthy of respect. This arrangement acknowledges that accomplishment while providing the scale and resources needed to compete nationally." "And TechGuard's board? Who would control the decision-making in this merged entity?" "A balanced representation from both companies, plus independent directors with industry expertise. I would likely take one of those independent positions, given my new advisory role." The true purpose behind Robert's investment in TechGuard was clear: creating a governance structure that would give him direct influence over Sentinel Shield without appearing to orchestrate a hostile takeover. "I see," David said neutrally. "And what made TechGuard suddenly interested in this approach rather than the straightforward acquisition they previously pursued?" "Market conditions have changed," Sentinel's California expansion makes it a more valuable partner, while TechGuard's recent technological acquisitions provide infrastructure Sentinel would take years to develop independently. It's a logical synergy. Interesting timing, though, David observed. Coming right after Mother's confrontation with Emily followed by background investigations into Sentinel's operations and outreach to our strategic partners. A moment of silence followed before Robert responded. "Your mother can be overzealous in her desire to protect family interests," he said finally. The pendant issue was regrettable. An emotional overreaction she now recognizes was inappropriate. But the business considerations are separate. This merger opportunity represents significant value creation for all stakeholders, including Wilson Investments with its newly acquired position in TechGuard, David noted, steel entering his voice. "We would benefit, yes," Robert acknowledged without apology. "But so would Sentinel's shareholders, including Emily. Her equity would translate to a significant position in a much larger enterprise. And what about Sentinel's company culture? The independent decision-making that's been central to Emily's leadership? The pendant that symbolizes both her personal heritage and Sentinel's brand?" Robert's voice took on a condescending tone. "Company culture evolves during any integration. As for the pendant, that unfortunate incident has been addressed. Your mother recognizes it holds personal significance for Emily." "Addressed how?" David pressed. "Because Mother has never actually apologized to Emily for demanding she surrender a family heirloom at our anniversary dinner." Another pause. Longer this time. When Robert spoke again, his tone had shifted to strategic conciliation. "Perhaps this merger discussion presents an opportunity to reset family relationships as well as business ones. Your mother and I would like to host a dinner with you and Emily to discuss both the personal and professional aspects of moving forward together." "I appreciate the invitation," David replied carefully. "But any business discussions regarding Sentinel's future need to happen with Emily directly involved from the beginning, not presented to her as a fait accompli after private conversations. With me." "Of course," Robert agreed smoothly. "Though I hoped you might introduce the concept first, help her see the strategic benefits without the emotional history clouding the discussion." Emily's strategic thinking is precisely why Sentinel has succeeded where many security startups have failed, David countered confidently. "She doesn't need concepts pre-filtered through me to evaluate their merit." "Naturally," Robert backpedaled. "I simply thought—" Patricia's voice interrupted. "Dinner's ready, you two. Enough business talk. Let's enjoy a family meal." The recording continued as they moved to the dining room. Patricia launched into a detailed account of her recent charity gala committee meeting, strategically shifting the conversation to social territory where she could reassert control. I listened carefully as the dinner progressed, noting how Patricia and Robert alternated between seemingly innocuous family updates and subtle probes about David's new position, my travel schedule, and Sentinel's board meeting calendar. They were mapping our movements, identifying vulnerabilities in our schedules, and gauging David's level of information about Sentinel's governance. Toward the end of the meal, Patricia shifted to a more personal tone, her voice taking on a wistful quality. "You know, David, with all this talk of business transitions, I've been reflecting on family traditions lately. The things that connect us across generations despite individual paths." "What kind of traditions?" David asked warily. "The Wilson family has always valued certain symbols of continuity," Patricia continued. "Your great-grandmother's diamond, brooch that I wore on my wedding day, the antique desk in your father's study. These physical connections to our history matter. They remind us who we are." She was circling back to the pendant issue, but approaching it through the lens of family heritage rather than direct demands. "I understand Emily's attachment to her grandmother's pendant," Patricia continued. "Having so few family connections herself, it's natural she would treasure what little she has. I should have been more sensitive to that." This wasn't an apology. It was a reframing that positioned me as someone to be pitied for having so few family connections, while casting Patricia as the more mature party who could recognize my attachment as an understandable overcompensation. Emily's connection to her pendant isn't about scarcity, David corrected. It's about honoring her grandmother's memory and the values she instilled: determination, resilience, building something meaningful from limited resources. The same values that guided her in creating Sentinel Shield. Patricia's voice took on a brittle quality. Of course, dear. I simply meant that family history provides context for our present choices. Speaking of which, your father mentioned a potential collaboration between TechGuard and Sentinel that sounds quite promising. The pivot was jarring but strategic, moving away from a topic where David had pushed back to reinforcing the merger narrative. As the evening concluded, Robert returned to his primary objective one final time. Think about what we've discussed, son. The TechGuard merger represents a unique opportunity to resolve both business and family tensions simultaneously. Emily maintains her leadership role while gaining access to significantly greater resources. Sentinel's innovations reach a national market more quickly, and the Wilson family moves forward together rather than divided by unnecessary conflicts. I'll consider it, David replied diplomatically. That's all we ask, Patricia added warmly. Just an open mind about possibilities that might benefit everyone involved. The recording captured the farewell pleasantries, followed by David's departure. I switched to the secure phone line, knowing he would call as soon as he was safely beyond the property. When my phone rang, I answered immediately. You did wonderfully. Maintained perfect composure while extracting significant intelligence. They're absolutely orchestrating a coordinated campaign, David replied tensely. The TechGuard merger, proposal, Mother's interference with Axiom, Dad's strategic investment position, it's all connected with a single objective: bringing Sentinel under Wilson family influence without appearing to stage a hostile takeover. And preserving their social narrative about supporting your career while accommodating your unconventional choice of partner, I added. The merger creates a face-saving solution to the public embarrassment of the anniversary dinner confrontation. David was quiet before responding. There's something else. They're operating with a sense of urgency I haven't seen before. Dad checked his watch several times, and Mother interrupted whenever the conversation veered from their apparent script. This aligned with patterns Marcus had noted, an acceleration in the Wilsons' timeline suggesting external factors we hadn't yet identified. We need to accelerate our countermoves, I decided. If they're operating with artificial time pressure, we can use that against them. People making rushed decisions often overlook critical details. What's our next step? David asked, the hour confirming the partnership that had solidified between us throughout this conflict. We move forward with both the California expansion and the Axiom partnership at an accelerated pace, creating established facts on the ground before they can implement whatever they're planning. And the TechGuard merger proposal? We'll request detailed terms in writing. Express cautious interest contingent on extensive due diligence, which gives us legitimate access to TechGuard's internal data while we solidify our independent strategy. David laughed appreciatively. Using their own tactics against them. They won't see that coming. They still fundamentally underestimate your strategic capabilities. Their persistent underestimation is our greatest advantage, I agreed. People reveal their true intentions when they believe they're dealing with someone who can't recognize the full implications of their actions. As I ended the call and prepared for David's arrival, I touched the pendant at my throat, a tangible reminder of what we were fighting for. Not just a piece of jewelry or a company logo, but the fundamental right to define our own legacy without manipulation or control by others. Patricia Wilson had demanded my pendant at our anniversary dinner, setting in motion a conflict that had now expanded far beyond that initial confrontation. What she hadn't anticipated was that in doing so, she had inadvertently strengthened both my resolve and David's. transforming us from individuals navigating separate challenges into true partners facing a common adversary with a clear plan to reclaim our narrative and secure our future together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.